All right, so next question is Freddie. Freddie, where are you? You up on the stage? Yeah, okay, wait for the microphone to come to you.
How do we view biblical and rabbinical ideas that don't fit into our society, i.e. stoning as a punishment?
Okay, so there are some things within the Bible and the Torah which we find a little bit jarring with our modern sensibilities, like stoning as a punishment and other forms of death penalty for having an affair or something like that. There's all kinds of things that jar with us. How do we deal with this?
I just want to make it's a good question and it really deserves a long answer, but maybe I'll just make a few brief points. In and of in itself, I don't think that it's obvious that capital punishment jars with current Western values or needs to jar with current Western values. Certainly here in Europe, we don't like the idea of capital punishment. In America, which in many ways is the most advanced and at least financially, economically, part of the Western world, many large parts of America don't have a problem with capital punishment. I don't think in and of in itself there's an obvious moral equation either way. It's perfectly feasible and possible for there to be crimes in which capital punishment, death, is an appropriate sanction. It's possible that people that commit heinous acts of evil deserve capital punishment. Our own loved state of Israel has put in its history one person to death, Eichmann, and has Nazi war crimes on its books as a.
It would also be interesting just to pause it to go any further, just to do a show of hands. Who here would say they support capital punishment in some cases? Raise your hands. Okay, and raise your hands if you wouldn't in all circumstances. Perhaps you could argue, what if you you find out later that the person's innocent? Yeah. So it seems like we're about 50-50 split.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So the idea that somehow capital punishment is obviously morally wrong with current standards, I don't think is correct. There are clearly dangers with capital punishment. One of those that you highlighted, which is the risk of what happens if you get it wrong. I think it's a danger in any legal system. If you've stolen 20 years of someone's life, in a sense, you can't really turn the clock back, and that's also irreparable damage. The person continues to live, but in the essence of a justice system is that the person is still borne incredible pain, and the damage done to the lost years of their life and relationships and achievements is perhaps irreversible. Nonetheless, clearly there is a greater danger with capital punishment. So you clearly need a system in place which demands very high standards of evidence. But in principle, in and of in itself, is it obviously immoral? Can it not be the case that capital punishment is ever appropriate? I don't think that's so, and I don't think we need to be troubled by Torah having it on the rule books. As it happens, we know from the Mishnah, from classic sources, that capital punishment was very rare, if ever, achieved. The standards of evidence asked for are very high. The standards of evidence are almost ridiculously high. We need a level of interrogation of witnesses that is all but impossible to achieve. The person has to have been warned. They have to be aware that there are witnesses present. The witnesses have to have told them, are you aware of the consequence of your act? Do you understand the punishment? Not only that, but the person has to respond. All the person has to do in order to avoid capital punishment is just not respond to the warning. Unless he responds and says, yes, warning noted, and nonetheless I want to proceed with my crime, then they're out of it. So capital punishment it would be rare, if ever. The Mishnah itself tells us, based on various sources, that it happened at best once in 70 years or even less. So in a sense, capital punishment in halacha was on the rule books without being applicable in most regular cases. A bit like, as I said, Israel has it on the rule books, and yet has applied it once in its 70-year
So is it more like
history.
Is it more like a deterrent kind of thing?
It may be a deterrent, or it may be something more fundamental. It may be that in theories of punishment, societal punishments, there are many explanations, many arguments put forward. Punishment, locking someone up in prison, may be a way of keeping someone off the streets. So it's to protect society. It may be a deterrent to scare criminals off from act. In the case of Judaism, of Torah, it probably is a reflection of values. It's reflecting a value that there are certain acts that are committed that can mean that someone has lost the right to life, the right to continue living. So it's probably an expression of values. The evidence for this is another Gemara which tells us that when the murder rate increased, the courts voluntarily stopped applying the death sentence. Now, why would that make sense? If it's there as a deterrent or to protect society, if the murder rate increases, surely you up the application of capital punishment. And the answer is it was never a great deterrent. As we explained, the levels of evidence needed are so significant that it was perhaps all but impossible to apply. It was an expression of value, a society which values human life so significantly that murder is something that rarely, if ever, occurs. There you can apply the death penalty in principle, because this is a society that understands so instinctively it's wrong. The society ceases to understand that value, and death sentence is not applicable. And I would argue in many of the other instances of death application of death sentence, we clearly don't live in a society in which our relationship to halacha and to Judaism is of such strength and conviction that it would ever be appropriate to apply the death sentence nowadays, which is one of several reasons why, indeed, we don't.
So you're saying the death penalty is really telling us this is what we value or really don't value, we think is really bad, and therefore this is what ought to happen to someone. Not that it most likely won't, because the criteria for convicting someone is so high, but here's what ought to happen to someone. And you're saying the less society is in tune with certain values, the less we should sort of convict.
You clearly can't, if the message is the value, the inherent value of what's happened, or lack of value of what's happened, you clearly can only convict someone who buys completely into the system, someone who shares those values, a world in which it's obvious that this is something terrible that's happened. And in the world of moral relativism, which even 2,000 years ago the Talmud identified as creeping up, and certainly in the modern era, within such a world, the possibility of us as a court system being able to say we apply death sentences is not one that's appropriate. But again, the concept of application of a death sentence, I don't think is immoral, even with today's values. And sometimes application of prison sentence, in which you draw someone away, you punish by a form of psychological torture and loneliness, in which you draw someone away from often that which is best in their lives, their significant relationships, achievement, ambition, goals and targets, and you put them in the society of other criminals. I'm not convinced that's always such a moral system. Prison, in theory, as a rehabilitation, perhaps a great ideal. Whether actually always lives up to it in the 21st century, I think should be questioned.
Very interesting. I also think prison has a lot of drawbacks. The other thing is stealing someone's time, so much of their time. It strikes me as quite cruel, to be honest.
It's also a theft of life. In many respects, not necessarily as far from capital punishment as we like admitting. Yeah,
I don't know what the alternative would be to prison, but it strikes me as something that is quite cruel and not always so constructive. I'd be interested to ask anyone that's against capital punishment if they could raise their hand and make a point, only because Rabbi Zobin is actually saying that the Torah really is less interested in convicting people, but more in sort of making a statement of here's what we value as really important, and here's what we're staunchly against. Is there anyone who thinks that in all instances there should not be even a belief that capital punishment is right or encoded within the system? Anyone want to make that argument? Anyone want to make that point? Fine. Okay. Well, I would basically say that I suppose the biggest challenge you could have to capital punishment is what if you get it wrong, and to that you would say, well, you need to have a very, very sort of rigid and high criteria for conviction.
We do need a rigid and high criteria for conviction. I think equally, as I mentioned, prison also is taking away years of people's lives and needs similar high standards of evidence. And finally, mistakes can creep into any system, and I don't think we need to be ashamed of that. We humans have to ultimately act as we can to the best of our ability. In all the decisions we make, clearly a decision of that significance needs very high standards of evidence. Can you build a system in which there's never any possibility of mistake? You can't. We, in Torah thinking, have a responsibility for the moral health of the world, and therefore the concept that we as humans should be able to apply moral judgments and criminal judgments and even capital punishment on is in principle one that's important. Even though, as long as you build appropriate safeguards in place, even though in any system there's a possibility of mistake, we humans make mistakes also.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should deny that.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.